Jack Rubenstein.
Thank you. Well, Beatrix's talk is going to be a tough act to follow. I'll do my best. The talk is going to be about an hour, so I promise to get you out of here before lunchtime or snack time or whatever. I'm reminded of the story. I gave a talk in Metlock in 1984, I believe. No, it was in 78, on the psychology of collecting. And my talk was the last one in the morning, and we had a very large audience. There must have been about 300, 350 people in a very nice Rococo theater in Metlock. And I was about to get up when somebody walked in and said, "The tour of the Metlock decorating plant will start immediately." And everybody just went out, and there went the audience. So we are going to lock the doors now, and this is your last chance, because I intend to speak to as many people as possible. The fact that you're all facing away from me, that means you can yawn without my seeing it, and I won't be insulted. The talk, not as stated in the program, split stoneware, I think it said, or split glazed. The proofreading in this group is not very good. It should obviously have been salt glazed stoneware. So I hope I won't disappoint those people that thought they were going to learn about something brand new.
Tour of the Metlock decorating will begin.
Thank you, Rich. Okay, well, we don't know how and we don't know when, but we do know where salt glazing started. Started in Cologne about the 15th century, right after the invention of stoneware. Stoneware itself was invented around the 12th century in that very same area, and it came about probably, and we're not sure, due to the invention or discovery of the high temperature furnace. Until then, clay had certainly been formed for tens of thousands of years. At first it was sun-dried, then it was dried over straw fires and wood fires. The fires kept getting hotter with the invention of small kilns or furnaces. But sometime in the 12th century, most likely due to the invention of the bellows, high temperatures were achieved in these furnaces. The potters found out that by blowing air into their fire, they could increase the temperature. And I often wonder what the thoughts were of the first person who fired his clay at around 1250 degrees Celsius, or say 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, and came up with a brand new material that was so hard that it could not even be scratched with steel. The material was impervious to water, it was hard, it was clear, it was just a brand new material. And this potter must have been rather amazed. He may have even thrown it away because that's not what he expected. But as soon as they found out what the properties of this stoneware was, they put it to good use. Such things as tiles for roofs, for pipes to carry water, and obviously drinking vessels. So soon this brand new, what we now call vitrified stoneware, came into wide use. Sometime, several hundred years later, again, somebody in that area experimented with doing something to the surface of that stoneware. We suspect, don't know obviously, that the first person to try the so-called salt glazing either dipped his wares into salt water or painted his wares with salt water. Got some of the salt on the surface of the uncured clay, stuck the whole thing into the furnace, and came out with a brand new surface treatment, which we now call salt glaze, which then made the surface very slightly shiny. Not very much, it was pretty matte. And sometimes after that, the potters must have experimented with using salt in different forms. From the painting or dipping into salt water, possibly to covering the surface with salt, and then finally into the salt glazing as we know today, namely to throw the salt into the furnace at the high temperature point. The furnaces that were used in the Westerwald area, and I will restrict myself to Westerwald, and the best known city within Westerwald known to most of us is Herk-Renshausen. the home of Vernon Rosizam and the Lastal factory, and many, many potters. Tewald, Merkelbach, the ones that we know very well. Plus the surrounding cities. These have been potters' centrums, certainly since the 16th century. And potters' families have moved there, have intermarried, have changed their names, and so on, and have learned to bring the art of stoneware to a true art form, in my opinion. It's in the eye of the beholder, obviously. The furnaces are fired, or were fired. I'm going to talk about the way it was, let's say, 100, 150, 200 years ago. The furnaces were fired with wood, and at the time, there were enormous wars between the potters and the foresters, because the foresters objected to having their forests cut down just by acres and acres in order to satisfy the potters' need for wood for their furnaces. The average furnace in the Herk-Lenzhausen and Westerwald area was about 25 to 40 cubic meters. The meter is 3 feet, so you can imagine the size of these furnaces. And each firing, which took about 48 hours, took 13 to 15 cords of wood. So that is a lot of wood per fire. And obviously the forests in the Westerwald area were in danger of being denuded by the potters' need for wood. So now let me go a little bit into the background, the science, and the art of salt glazing, and tell you a little bit about it. And as I said before, and I will say it repeatedly, in my mind, the Westerwald stoneware is among some of the most beautiful stoneware that has been created, either in steins or in non-drinking vessel art. And any of you that go to the Westerwald and go to the ceramic museum in Herk-Lenzhausen, right opposite the Lastal factory, you will see things that you wouldn't believe could be made out of stoneware. Okay, if I could have the lights, please, we will go ahead with their switch here.
Right.
Ta-da! Works. Here we have a salt-glazed pot that greets the visitor coming into Herk-Lenzhausen, because Herk-Lenzhausen is known as the center of salt-glazed stoneware. They're enormously proud of it. You see examples of it everywhere in town, and as a means of introduction, this is what greets the visitor. Now let me tell you something about what salt glazing is. And please remember that at the conclusion of my talk, I will hand out test papers. And we will grade you, and you will have your grades by this evening. Salt glazing is fairly simple. I put it in chemical terms, but I will explain what they all are. On the top row, NaCl is sodium chloride, and that's just your plain old table salt. H2O, I think everybody knows as water. And the next symbol, the Al2O3,5SiO2, is a shorthand notation for the chemistry of clay. Now, clay is a much more complicated material than this, and it would totally snow you folks if I put it all down, so I simplified it. The O stands for oxygen, and we call things that contain oxygen oxides. So the first item is aluminum oxide, and it is combined with silicon oxide. Silicon oxide is just plain sand, but this is a composition of sand and alumina and various other metals and their oxides, so we call that clay for short. Then we go into the second line, and we have that arrow pointing to the right with a little triangle underneath. That means the reaction is going in that direction under great heat. The triangle means heat. And it forms that long thing that we have bracketed, which we call salt glaze. And you notice it's just the sodium oxide of the aluminum, and it's given off HCl, which is hydrochloric acid. In other words, the sodium chloride has combined with the alumina, and we have the salt glaze, and it's a very, very simple thing. Obviously, the first potters that used it, I mean, it was pure trial and error. The fact that they came up with this, I can only say was luck. I don't know how many other things they tried, but they obviously came up eventually with the right solution. One of the problems with salt glazing is that little 2HCl, or hydrochloric acid, on the right. Hydrochloric acid is very, very corrosive. It is especially corrosive in its vapor form. And of course, under the great heat that's in that furnace, that HCl is given off as a white cloud. and that will kill vegetation in the area. It will attack your lungs, and it does all sorts of things, including attacking the clay itself. Once it's been salt glazed, the hydrogen chloride will still attack the clay and give us a pebbled surface, which we call orange peeling. And if you look at any of the salt glazed stoneware steins in the stein room and feel the surface, you will find that it's got this pebbly or like an orange peel feel to it. And all those little pock marks were caused by the attack of HCl. These two slides are reversed for some reason. I don't know what happened there. What happens is, I'm sorry, this should have been the first slide. The sodium chloride and the water under the high heat break up into sodium oxide. And that HCl and the sodium oxide goes on. I won't bore you with that, so I think I've talked about that enough. Now let's talk about some of the salt glazed stoneware that we have found. This is a collection of shards, as you see. None of these pieces are in very good condition. They were collected by Professor Spiegel in Grenzau, which is near Grenzhausen. Grenzau is famous for its three-sided castle tower. In fact, there's a stein, I believe, in the members' auction tomorrow of Burg Grenzau, Grenzau Castle. And Professor Spiegel had collected all these shards from around the area, and he spent his life putting them together, dating them, categorizing them, cataloging, and so on. And he had them stored in his tower, his three-wall tower. Professor Spiegel, unfortunately, died several years ago, and so his work will probably never be completed. This is part of his collection, as it was in that three-sided tower. And I say it was because, as you read in Prosit about 5 years ago, one night thieves drove up in a truck and cleaned out the tower. The German equivalent of the FBI was called in, and to my knowledge, none of that stoneware has ever been retrieved. Just lost forever. We don't know where it is, whether it left Germany or whether it went underground. But it's a real shame because Professor Spiegel had a definitive collection of the Westerwald stoneware, some phenomenal pieces that perhaps with this theft we will never have an opportunity to see again. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how this stuff is made. I'm going to show you, obviously, 20th century pictures, because I didn't have a camera when I was around the 19th century. These pictures were all taken in the early 1980s. The amazing thing is that very little changed in the 200 years, let's say, between 17 and 1900. The technique is very much the same. The only difference is that electric motors have replaced the kick wheels for the potters use. Electric pumps are used instead of having to carry water and so on. But the handwork is still the same. Here you see two people working at an electrically driven potter's wheel forming pots. Now these fellows are amazing because they will work without templates, they will work without measuring devices, and at the end of the day, when they've completed their day's work and you go over their production, you will find that they're all identical. You can tell the difference between different workers of product, but one worker will turn out the same thing from many, many years of experience. They're hand forming these, and if you take a hand-formed beer stein and run your fingers down the inside of the stein, you will feel the grooves left by the fingers of the man who drew up the clay and made that pot. Here you see another pot being made by another worker. You see the wheel a little bit better, and you see the way he's forming it. This was just a plain slab of clay that he centered on the wheel and then drew it up with his hands. Everybody ought to get an experience doing that once, because it's the strangest feeling to take this blob of clay and then draw it up into something which is recognizable as a pot or a stein or something. It's just an astounding feeling. It may not be the kind of thing that you can go and get $200 or $300 for, but it'll be your own creation and you'll be very, very proud of it and amazed. Here's another way of making a pot, not using a wheel per se, but this fellow has a form. And the form on the inside has all the patterns of the stein that he's going to make. In other words, somebody made a model stein, then he made a plaster of Paris cast of that stein, which then became the negative. And this fellow has filled the entire pot with clay. and he's going to squeeze that clay towards the outside of that pot so that it takes on the shape of that negative impression. And he's going to use that thing that's hanging to his upper right. In German, it's known as a Galgen. The only translation I can give you of that is gallows. And I'm not exactly sure. The analogy is far stretched, I'm afraid. But what he's going to do, he's going to use that device, and I'll show it in the next picture, to force the clay towards the wall, and also, of course, to make it hollow. There it is. He's brought this gallows device down. The pot is spinning below him, and he is scraping out all the excess clay, leaving just enough for the wall, which will have the impression of the decoration on its outside. And here's yet a third way of forming steins, and this is the way it's really being done now, not necessarily by hand, because companies like Gertz have it totally mechanized. Gertz will form a stein totally untouched by human hands, up to and including the time it's put into the box for shipping. But this is a little bit more manual. This fellow is standing in front of a whole bunch of molds. These molds are plaster of Paris, and I'll tell you in a moment why it's got to be plaster of Paris. And he is holding a hose with a nozzle that's being fed by a tank in the floor above him that has a dilute solution of clay called slip. It's just a mixture of lots of water and clay, and it's sort of soupy, and it's easily pumped, or it flows through that pipe. And he will fill the cavity of that mold, and he'll swill it around a little bit, and then pour out the excess. So now what you've got is a thin layer of this clay slip on the inside of the mold. And the reason that we have used plaster of Paris for these molds is that the water in this slip, namely in this dilute solution, is absorbed through the plaster of Paris away from the clay, leaving a more concentrated clay, which will eventually dry into the body of the object that's being molded. Here he is opening the mold, and you see that inside is something that really looks like a bottle more than a clay because of that slightly restricted neck. He will cut away that neck, and the clay can be reused. It's a 3-part mold. In fact, it may even be a 4-part mold. And very often on mass-produced steins, you will actually see the mold marks where 2 molds came together, and the clay built up a little bit in the little tiny space between the sections of the mold. Here you see this bottle-shaped thing sitting on another mold, and he is reassembling the mold that he just took apart for its next use. These molds can be used probably for 200-300 impressions, and then a new mold will be made from the master. When you look at some steins, very often you'll find that the image is very, very sharply defined. I'm talking about relief steins. And when the image is so sharply defined, you can be sure that it was one of the early impressions of a mold. When it gets a little bit dull and not so sharp anymore, then the mold has been used almost to the full extent of its useful life. If you read Roland Henshin's article about Albert Jacob Tewald in the last issue of Prosit, Roland remarked quite correctly that one of the reasons for Tewald's quality is that they will not use molds as long as some other potters. They would just as soon replace their molds after about 150 impressions to make sure that the customer gets a really good stein. And here he is finishing off that stein. Remember that used to be the bottle-shaped thing. He has cut off almost the entire top and tossed it back into the clay pile. He's added a handle to it. He's got it on a wheel right now to make sure that it's nice and level. Obviously a lot of handwork involved, but still another technique for making the object of our love. Here this gentleman is sitting at a spray booth, and he will be spraying the stein with a colored glaze. Most likely he will use a cobalt oxide glaze that is the blue with which we are most familiar. After he has sprayed it, and that's a little wheel inside that's also turning so that he covers the entire surface as the thing turns. Some of it will be wiped away so that again the gray surface shows and you get a two-colored stein. This is opposed to hand painting where you don't have to do this sponging or washing. Let me change the subject a little bit. These folks are not making beer steins, they're making true stoneware bottles. They're known as Steinhager bottles, sort of schnapps that one drinks to aid the digestion. The machine was invented by the gentleman on the left. If you don't believe me, you should try it once. It really helps. It's an amazing machine. The machine gets its little globs of clay, and as the thing turns around, at each station something else happens, and this bottle is slowly drawn up and necked, so that by the time it reaches all the way around counterclockwise to the lady on the right, you've got this Steinjäger bottle. It's usually a brown glazed bottle. It's got a bale and porcelain cap on it, and it's used for this liquor. I believe both these folks are now dead, but it was an amazing machine to see in this tiny little shop. Now we come to the hand decorating. Now, you notice that before the three techniques I showed you for making steins were all being done by men. Well, the Potter Society is still pretty sexist in Germany, so all the production of the bodies is done by the men, and the decorating is done by the women. But the women are really famous because there's a statue to a pottery lady in front of City Hall of her Grenzhausen. This young lady is painting the blue cobalt oxide glaze on a air-hardened body. It hasn't been fired yet. It's just been allowed to dry in the air for about 24 hours, and now it's hard enough. It's got a leather hardness so that it can be handled probably without leaving fingerprints on it. But occasionally you do see a stein or an object that does have the handler's fingerprints on it. She's painting this decoration in blue. She may have a design stenciled on, but more than likely she's done this often enough so that she can get all around the body of this jug without crossing over, and the design will be perfect. She is known as a blue lady because that's what she does. They sit on little stools and do this day in, day out. Here's a woman doing a similar job, but she's incising a design. She's got a little wooden tool similar to what the ladies sometimes use to trim the skin behind fingernails. I don't know what they're called, but it's a little pointed wooden stick. It's like a pencil without the lead in it, and she is incising the design. Now, she is so good again that she will start at one side of the handle, she will continue her design all around the body of that stein, end up at the other end of the handle, and you can bet that the central motif will be dead center. And you see her production sitting beside her, and there's a foreman involved who keeps her busy all day long. This woman is also doing hand incising. You can see the tool that she's holding in her right hand, and she will just do this day in, day out. Now, they can change designs. She will be told that you'll make 10 like this and 100 like that, and so on. And they're just very, very good at the work that they do. I want you to note, though, that all these operations I'm showing you are being done by people, and this body's being picked up and put down and being operated on continuously. And yet, when you consider the price of a stein when you visit her Grenzhausen, just a few marks, it's amazing that something that has been handled so much can really be that inexpensive. Here's another blue lady. She's painting a blue band on it. She's very, very typical. She's an older woman sitting on a three-legged stool, surrounded by pots, and she'll do this 8 hours a day with just a couple of breaks in between. This lady is attaching handles to the bowls or jugs or whatever you might call them in front. These are not the kind of handles that we have in steins. They're horizontal handles. There will be two handles, one on each side. I cannot show you a slide of a handle being applied to a beer stein. I'll tell you why. I was going around, this was around Christmas time, and between the beginning of December and December the 24th, the workers in her Grenzhausen potteries will work a couple of extra hours each day so that on Friday afternoon they get the afternoon off. Because as many of you know, you can't go shopping in Germany on Saturday afternoon. Everything closes at 1 o'clock, except the first Saturday of the month. So in order to do their Christmas shopping, they wanted Friday afternoon off. Well, I was on a tour of the potteries, and I got to this particular pottery where I was supposed to watch handle being attached a little bit late. But the foreman, knowing that this crazy American was coming, had orders to keep one handle lady, and that's what they're called, the Henkelfrau, behind, and she was mad. because I was cutting into her free time. So what she had done is she had prepared 6 handles in advance that she had laid out, and this was done by just taking clay and rolling it between her hands, like making little sausages. And she had these 6 handles laid out, then she had 6 Stein bodies laid out on the other side to be combined. So the foreman was looking at me, and I fumbled with my camera, and I told him to wait a second. He told her to wait, and then I turned on my ready light on my flash. Well, he misinterpreted that motion and thought I was ready, and he gave her the go-ahead. And before my flash went on, she had put the 6 handles on the Steins, she had taken off her apron, and she was out of the door. Here we see them stacking a furnace. Because the furnace takes so much energy to fire, so much wood or coal or whatever it is, they stack these furnaces as tightly as they can. Now they've got to leave a little space between so that the heat, the hot gases, can reach all the surfaces of the vessels. They're stacked upside down so that no dust or anything can fall into the body and ruin the inside, but they're stacked very, very closely. I think I've got a close-up look. Yeah, they waste no space. Now when you have a furnace this full of product, and it takes about 48 hours to complete the entire cycle, your whole production is dependent on that firing cycle. So you've got to be very, very careful. And in the old days, before they had good temperature control, you can imagine how important it was that the potter or the furnace operator would look into that furnace occasionally and judge by the color of the fire at what stage he was in the firing process. Because if he underfired or overfired or made any mistakes, that entire batch would have to be destroyed. And at that point, not only was the clay gone, because once fired it can't be recycled, but all that handwork was done. So firing was very, very carefully watched. Here you see the inside of that fellow's furnace who made the Steinhager bottles. You see all these little bottles stacked very, very tightly in a very, very rough, handmade furnace. The furnace is made of brick, and then it's lined with fire clay that's been applied by hand, patted on, basically. And every so often it's got to be repaired, and you see this is the way it looks. It looks like a natural cave, but it isn't. It's a handmade object. Now, in the top rows, you'll see these bottles with great big holes in them. And they ain't going to hold much liquor, I'll tell you that. So the question is, what are these bottles? What are they used for? Well, the market for Steinhager wasn't all that great, and they figured, what can they do with this one single shape that's being made by their machine? That machine wasn't going to make anything else. Those are bird feeders. And you see a lot of them in the area. People buy them as souvenirs. They're rather pretty when they're fired. They're hung up by the neck, and the birds sit on a perch and peck inside the opening, or it can be used as a bird house. They also make a small version where they just cut the bottle in half, basically, and I'll show you one of those later. Here's the wood supply for a firing of that same furnace. Here you see the double furnace from the outside, same one we just saw. That wood will last for one firing of those 2 furnaces. So the waste is just enormous, but we will talk about what is being used today. Now we come to the salt glazing. Here you see the firing process. And now they do use women because it's pretty hot there and the men don't really like that work. When it comes time to fire one of these 20, 25, 30 cubic meter furnaces, all hands go below. These are fired from the bottom. They're updraft furnaces. And it's very, very important. One of the things that the potters have learned over the years, that the temperature must increase at a very steady and constant rate. You can't have it go up and then down a little bit and up and down and so on. Because once the clay has gotten up to a certain temperature and you suddenly drop the temperature, we all know what will happen. It'll crack. So there's got to be an ever-increasing temperature. That means that they've got to watch that fire continuously. They can judge from the color what the temperature is. You know, if it's dull red, it's not very warm. If it's orange, it's getting hotter. If it's yellow-white, then it's hot. And they've got to keep shoveling in that wood. And they do it pretty manually. It's like a stoker on a ship or on a locomotive in the old days, the steam engines. They've got to keep stoking those furnaces. And on top of the furnace, on the roof, where it is predictably warm, there stands the fellow who's tossing in the salt. He's doing that right now. In the front, you'll see that little buggy that's holding plain old white table salt, sodium chloride. And he's got a long-handled shovel, and he's got these openings in the roof of the furnace, and he's shoveling in the salt because the furnace is now at its highest temperature, around 1250 degrees Celsius. Now you will notice a little bit of the smoke being emitted there in the upper right, and this hydrogen chloride is all over the place. And the second thing I want you to notice is that this man is not wearing any protection for his breathing system. In the United States, our OSHA office, the Office of Safety and Health Administration, would shut this operation down in 3 minutes. But there they do this, and the interesting thing is, here he is again, and now you see some of those hydrogen chloride fumes that he's being emitted from the salt that he's shoveling in. He is wearing glasses to protect him from the clay. But you know, there's an interesting thing, that the people that work in potteries in Hertlandshausen never get a cold. And that may well be due to the fact that they've been breathing these fumes and vapors all their lives, and either their lungs are gone entirely, or they've built up a protective coating on their lungs. We don't know, but it seems to have some beneficial effects. The bus for Hertlandshausen leaves after lunch. Now here we see just a selection of the salt glazed stoneware. This is from a page in the book Pottery and Porcelain by Cox, and all these diverse shapes. Clay is a beautiful material to work with because it can be formed into infinite shapes. And that's, I think, what gives it this beauty, that it's only the imagination of the potter that limits what he can do with it. So here's one selection. Here's some pots that from or jugs, I guess is the proper thing to call them, from a catalog of the turn of the century. And the interesting thing is that these jugs were sold by volume, and not by volume per jug, but per volume per shipment. So for instance, you would buy 100 liters worth of jugs. And if you bought 100 liters worth of 1 liter jugs, obviously you got 100 of them. If you bought 100 liters worth of half-liter jugs, you got 200 of them. But the price was per 100 liters. So for instance, you paid 24 marks, which in those days was around $6, exchange rate was 4 to 1, $6 for perhaps 100 1-liter jugs. Not very expensive. But they were the most utilitarian vessels, even though they were decorated. They were used to store milk, wine, beer, whatever. They did a good job of it, kept it cool, kept it from evaporating, and but dirt cheap. We find very few of these, and they really should be called rare because most of them were broken. Who needed one of these stupid things after perhaps the milk starts to taste a little bit sour? You bust it up. That's what you did with it. You didn't save it to be auctioned off in 1991 by Stein Collectors International. Here's a page, I think actually it's the cover, of Tewad's catalog of new steins. These are all reproductions, but they're reproduction of the old steins. You see an old blue-gray salt clay stein. You see a funnel stein, bottom center. Some of the Frechen and Siegburg types, the white clay, and then the flat bottle, the field bottle type of design. Very typical of the area. I hope Werner Sam isn't in the room because he may be embarrassed by this photograph. This is the way his collection looked at one time. And those of you that have seen the new Glastal collection on the 3rd floor of the office complex will note a slight difference. But Werner, of course, as you all know, and I hope as most of you have seen, has the definitive collection of drinking vessels in the world. I don't think there's a collection anywhere even approaching the diversity and the styles of drinking vessels. In the Glastal collection, you see the history of drinking vessels in glass and ceramic. And of course, he is a great collector of Westerwald stoneware, and here you see an early collection of his just stored all over the place. Now let's go into some of the designs and so on. Here is a peasant dance jug. It's got a little bit of everything on it. It's got the bearded man, the Bellarmine face that we just heard about on Beatrix, and then the peasant dance design. Notice that a new color has appeared that I haven't really talked about yet. And those are those purple stripes. Sometime in the 18th century, it was discovered that not only cobalt oxide gave a nice glaze, but manganese oxide. Manganese oxide is a tricky material. Unlike the cobalt, which can take all sorts of temperature variations, manganese will either fire an ugly brown at low temperatures or black at high temperatures. So the temperature control has to be very carefully done, and you'll find sparing use of the purple manganese. Here you have something that is called Cologne brown, and you saw it again in the Bellarmine jugs that Beatrix showed you before. It's an iron oxide type of glaze. The reason that these glazes were popular is that it could withstand quite variations in temperature. But you see that even here, on the left side, there's that light ring. What happened there, most likely, is that a bottle stood too close to it, and the full effect of the hot fumes was not felt on this particular one, so that wasn't fired quite as well as the rest of the bottle. But this is a salt-glazed bottle of Cologne brown coloration. Here you have two very typical Westerwald steins, as many of you know. And these steins, of course, are very valuable today, but they were not about 3 or 4 years ago. And I congratulate Stein Collectors International, all the members, for recognizing the value of these. Because unlike other steins that were more mass-produced, even though enormous quantities of these steins were made, each one was hand-decorated. And although you may find two with the same design, you will not find two identical ones. It's almost like snowflakes, because the artist is just, it's impossible for him to do exactly the same thing all the time. So you'll find very minor variation. And if you buy an old Westerwald stein, you will have a unique, one-of-a-kind stein. No question about it. You may see others like it, but not exactly like it. Here's some more, show you some of the shapes. The pear-shaped one with a very plain design, and then the other one with that interesting necking in process and a floral design. Again, the designs were limited only by the potter's innovative ability, and everything was tried. Clay is a beautiful surface on which to put something. It cries for being decorated. Here you have another stein, also in an iron oxide firing. It does not come from Cologne, it comes from the Westerwald, but it's got that decor. Now notice the relief on the bottom, that is molded in. There are two types of relief. One is the molded type, where the mold already had the design. The second one is what we call applied relief. This is where the relief portion is cut separately like a cookie. And the people that are most famous today for this kind of design are the Wedgwood folks. Then these cookie shapes, if you will, are very carefully applied to the body of the stein using that dilute solution that I talked about before, slip. So it's a slip applied, but this is a molded relief. Here you have the small version of that Steinhager bottle. When I visited this gentleman, he offered to give me one of those big bottles, but I didn't really feel like carrying that thing back in my luggage. So he gave me this little one, but it shows you the bale and porcelain cap that's used to seal this. I think that a couple of beer companies are coming back to this. I think there's a Japanese beer, and of course Grolsch beer from Holland uses this kind of a stopper. It's got a little rubber gasket on the inside to give it a really tight seal. Here you have three very, very typical 1-liter salt-glazed steins. You can tell they're from my collection because of the Munich Childs. You'll see more Munich Child steins later on because that's all I really have access to photograph. But these, notice the very elaborate designs that were put on these. They were probably hand-painted. In other words, the artist painted only the blue background colors, then sponged the front a little bit to make sure that there was no blue on those figures, although they'd have a slightly bluish tint. There's a great diversity, of course, in lids. They're very heavy. stoneware is heavy. The only exception to that are the Kreuzensteins. The Kreuzensteins are stoneware, but they have very, very thin body cross sections. So when you pick up an honest-to-goodness Kreuzenstein, you will be amazed at its lightness. These things are heavy. You can imagine how much they weigh with a liter of beer. Here's some miniatures. The tallest one on the left is only about 3.5 inches tall, so it gives you an idea of the others. The one on the right, I believe, is just about 3. And, but nevertheless, the decor is fairly complex, and they're all salt glazed. The salt glazing gives it a nice semi-gloss, I would say, and that slightly pebbled surface. Here's an interesting, almost Wedgwood-like design. The blue is not very dark, and I suspect that was done on purpose. The artist did not want that dark blue. The handle is actually a little bit darker than the floral or the leaf design on the front. This is a sort of little combination of everything. It's got the bearded man on the neck, and it's got the twist handle design, and then the floral design has got a verse on the front. Here you have some very typical Maßkrüge, 1 liter mugs used in the various drinking establishments in Bavaria. No true Bavarian would ever drink out of anything less than a 1 liter mug. Women may get half liters, but they have to hide in a different room. But when you go into a beer garden, or when you went into a beer garden some years ago, this is what you would get served. I put that in the past tense because lately, again, civilization is upon us. Health laws have decreed that stoneware isn't really all that hygienic, and that bacteria could be absorbed on the inner surface of that clay, and therefore glass is now required, which is bad news for us collectors, but good news for Rastal. They're the glass stein manufacturers, for those of you that don't know. Here is another fairly typical stein in a fairly heavy relief. Notice the twisted handle and very detailed decor. Unlike the faience steins and some of the other stoneware steins from the area, the Westerwald people liked to really fill up every square inch of what they had available. They hated to have just a plain surface. They went for complete detail. I've seen some of these stein decors called kitsch. Kitsch is, I don't know how to translate that, but it's sort of junk art. And at one time it probably was. These were the souvenir steins. I mean, no self-respecting Westerwalder would ever drink out of this. It was put on a mantelpiece as a souvenir or shipped to America. We'll buy anything. Here's another stein, a fairly tall one. It's got manganese purple bands, top and bottom. Very popular decor. A young man courting his sweetheart. This always sold well. Another interesting stein. Again, this could almost be mistaken for Wedgwood. The blue is almost powder blue. It's an applied relief. All those very detailed little scrolls in the arch and so on were hand applied. In other words, the white clay was cut out on a wooden board, formed, then carefully lifted off, and believe me, careful is the word, and then applied to that body. The detail can be just fantastic. And then the whole thing was salt glazed. Another one, this is sort of a pictorial stein. It's interesting. The motif is set in, similar to a shadow frame. Very, very light compared to the border designs. The reason I'm showing all these steins is to give an idea of the variety that's available, all under that single term of salt glazing. Different color. Here what was done was to use an iron oxide, which will fire brown towards black, and with a pearl design, although this does come from the Westerwald. And a little bit of green was put in. Now there's certain oxides of iron. Iron comes in different states. I won't discuss the chemistry of that. That will fire green. This took some fairly careful firing. It does not look like the typical Westerwald, but it is. As you all know, salt glazed steins are also made in the shapes of characters. And here are two They're not all that common, they're relatively rare, and they do command higher prices, as you have found out. But notice, every square inch or centimeter is decorated. Nothing is left untouched. This is an interesting one. I always point this one out because this is decorated almost all in manganese, purple, with only very slight amounts, I mean tiny, cobalt blue. The medal that the general is wearing on his left breast is in cobalt blue, and so is that band at the bottom. As I mentioned before, manganese is very sensitive color, and the potter that made this had what I would call guts, because he probably loaded his furnace with all this manganese decorated material, and he must have sweated that firing cycle. Because if he had fired about 50 degrees too high, this thing would have turned black. If he'd fired about 50 degrees too low, it would have been a dull brown, and the batch probably would have been ruined. I think this is about as fine an example of almost all manganese purple that I've ever seen. Here are 3 Munich child character steins. The one in the center is probably the most common. It's a Reinemann. It's very similar to the Reinemann colored series. The one on the right is seen occasionally. I believe the one on the left is pretty rare. I have not seen too many of those. It does not have a pewter rim around the lid, so it rests ceramic on ceramic. And you see these on occasion. Gary has them in his auctions, Les has them in his auctions occasionally. But you don't see them too often. I think they make a nice counterpoint to the full color Munich child character steins. Here's another character, the ram. Notice all the detail of the ram's woolly hide. Every little, whatever I guess you could call it, the featheriness of the wool is shown. A lot of detail work is involved here. Here's a punch bowl made by Goertz of the decor of the castles along the Rhine, and it's a very, very dark cobalt blue, almost what we might call a midnight blue. This took a lot of work to do, and these things are fairly tough to fire. You all know that very large Germania plaque. It's a meter in diameter that was on sale yesterday, and I think you saw it on the wall of Paul Keck's house in the presentation that Les made before. That was very difficult to fire, because how could you keep that 1 meter diameter plaque from bending upwards or downwards or somehow being distorted by the fire? And that's why you don't see very many large plaques or very, very large punch bowls, because it's so difficult to have them keep their shape at those temperatures. Here are some minis, all salt glazed, and you even have one on the far left that's got a decal on it. Now the decal was applied after the salt glazing. The salt glazing process would have totally burned off the decal, so this was salt glazed, and the decal was applied, and a final finish was put over to protect the decal. Another pear-shaped pouring jug, light blue. Apparently the artists liked the light blue for these larger vessels, and it's interesting. And here you can see, I think, certainly in the reflection portion, right, dead center, of this orange peel effect that I was talking about. This jug was fairly heavily attacked by hydrogen chloride. That means it wasn't vented out fast enough. What they try to do is get rid of that hydrogen chloride as quickly as possible. This is a turn-of-the-century stein designed by Riemerschmidt for Merkelbach. And I like the design on it, but again, you can see the orange peel effect, the very plain design. What I want you to note especially is the flowing design of the lid, the thumb lift, and the handle. It's all sort of one wave. It's typical of the Jugendstil, or the Art Nouveau, as it's sometimes called. In Austria, it's called Secession Steel. It is not Art Deco. Art Deco, as you may know, is angular, but the Jugendstil was a flowing design. Jugendstil, by the way, does not mean the style of youth, or youthful style, as is often interpreted. There was a store in Germany that at the turn of the century called itself Youth, Jugend. That was the name of it. And it was interested in getting all these new designs that were coming in from Austria, from England, from France, and of course from Germany. And therefore the style that was